So once upon a time, a foolish young man looked at that and thought, I want to make that, but in a game. Spoilers, I didn't. But throughout the process, I did end up creating something different, and something that I thought got quite close, and that's what this talk is about. Bit of background. So this is a photo of me from around 10 years ago, back when I was just a wee little lad, like around this high. I was a pretty normal kid. If you were to ask me about anime, I would probably have responded with something like, oh yeah, Naruto, I love that stuff. And then I became friends with this guy. His name was Joe Liu, and he sent me down a path with no return. 1 year later, I was the head of our school's anime club. I owned a Dakimakura, and had committed the entirety of Moteke Sailor Fuku, the opening song of Lucky Star, to memory. That was a dark period of my life, and I told myself I would never go through it again. So of course, 10 years later, I'm making a game about anime, and the first of which, Necrobarista, we have been developing since 2015. We had one aim, we had one goal, and that was to cheaply and effectively replicate the experience of anime. Now, I emphasize experience because we knew from the get-go it would be impossible to, well, if we want to make an anime, we just make an anime. Like, don't make a game, like, just make an anime. And whenever you talk about experiential design, you often refer to top-down design. So that's kind of, you set yourself a goal, and then you find various solutions to achieve a goal. To give you guys like an idea of the budget for our game, we're creating 5 hours of content over 12 months with 2 animators and 1 3D artist. So this is something that a lot of folks out there can do themselves. We'll start with a pretty broad question. What makes anime look good? Because there's obviously like a lot of different types of anime or manga art styles, and to kind of just, you know, gloss it over like, I'm gonna just do an anime thing, that's, you know, that could be anything. So we really need to start thinking about what it is inside anime that we want to replicate and want to achieve inside our game. Let's use an example. So this is from the anime adaptation of Berserk. The version on the right was the TV broadcast, which was heavily criticized for its use of CG. On the left, we have the Blu-ray remaster, and as you can see, the girl is completely redrawn. They don't even use the 3D model anymore. Like, yeah, let's just throw that out. And you know, it's drawn by hand. And when we compare the two, we ask ourselves, what's missing from the CG version? Because I don't know about you guys, but I feel the left version is better. They both have line art. You know, they both use that flat shading, cell shading style. The designs are identical. The colors are the same. In fact, if you were to pass the 2 images through like the kind of Google, you know, filter kind of thing, like the computer algorithm's like, oh yeah, this is the exact same thing. But it's not the exact same thing. It's very different. And you know, at the same time, we can't dispute that the image on the right, like, isn't anime. It is anime. You showed that to anyone, like, yeah, this is anime. It's not very good anime, but it's anime. It's anime, all right. It's just not hand-drawn, and that's the point I want to make. Okay. What makes anime look good, I believe, isn't necessarily the style itself, right? What we're trying to achieve in our games when we talk about the anime style is the illusion that these assets are hand-drawn. The illusion that, and it's not an illusion because at the end of the day, like, it is hand-produced, right? We do have artists, you know, working their asses off to produce this thing. And so what we need to facilitate is a style that lets these artists' work show through to the end product. So our first job is to figure out what makes something look hand-drawn. Sorry, this is a bit basic to the artists out there, and I'm sure there's a lot of artists out there, but I'm going to quickly gloss over this. Before we learn to draw, we look at a picture of a tree, and then we draw something like this. It's an icon, it's an idea of a tree, right? Our brain automatically breaks down the complicated image of the tree and simplifies it for us. But with repeated practice, we train our brains to stop seeing the ideas, stop seeing the leaves, the trunks, and the horizon. When a trained artist draws, she sees shapes, edges, and color, right? She becomes a camera, absorbing as much visual information as she can while discarding her human nature for simplification. And we make something like that. And, the same process you can apply to anything. However, the important part is that humans aren't perfect. And most importantly, we don't like perfect things. Apologies to the realist fans out there, but most people don't like things that are completely perfect. We like something with a bit of a twist. And within this continuum between pure reality and pure abstraction, that's like a big, continuum where art lies. And the halfway nature of drawings allows us to easily trace our own experiences and kind of imprint those ideas upon that of the artist. But these days, however, we have computers, and computers are perfect. And it's because of this perfection that makes them so bad at generating quote-unquote art. This is true for any art style, even in ultra-realistic art styles. And games, human design is required. We call this art direction, color coordination, all that stuff. So now I want to take this a step further. When we draw, we teach ourselves to become like machines. All we have to do right now is reverse that process. We want to replicate imperfection. To discuss the specific elements that drawings are comprised of, I'll be using the framework set out by Betty Edwards in her book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. Highly recommended book for anyone interested in learning how to draw with the basics. The framework divides these elements into 5 categories: edges, spaces, relationships, shading, and the GESTALT. So now we're going to step through each one and see how we found various ways to teach machines how to draw with these elements. We'll start with the simplest one, shapes. This artist is Dorman Seman, a fantastic manga artist when it comes to shapes. And at first, when we started our research into anime art styles, we looked at a lot of images similar to this. We browsed through Tumblr, we browsed through Pinterest, Pixiv, and we're like, yeah, this is a really nice picture. This is like a really, really nice picture. I'm trying to get at exactly what that essence, that je ne sais quoi of what makes that appealing to us. And we found out that was actually a mistake. Don't study anime art. Study manga, paneling, study anime cinematography. Study the way that art style is actually used to put things into motion, right? And that's a big difference, right? And through that, we found out, the way that animators use pans over rotations, right, due to the limitation of the medium. The frequent use of holds, character-based blocking, simplistic compositions, lack of deep space. Like, these are the things that will make your game, not your 3D render. You can do 3D renders fine, but your game, if you want your game to look like anime, you can't just look at the surface things. You have to look at, how everything works when you put it together. So you enable composition, right? That's how you create the feeling of this kind of hand-drawn shape. Simplify to create focus by simplifying your textures. You can simplify your meshes, simplify your lighting. Engage with your camera and focus on your characters. So I'm going to quickly switch over to a Unity build of our game right now and kind of show you guys the various tools we created to help with this. Now this is a scene inside Necro... Wait, oh, you guys can't see that, can you? Oh dear. Just one moment. Cool. So one of the tools that we created earlier on in Necrobarista was we wanted something that can really quickly allow us to iterate over our camera shots and compositions. And so we created this kind of like camera guide over here. And as you can see, like, we have a grayscale toggle. This is very, very useful for, I'll just quickly play the game. This is very useful for figuring out the values inside the game. The tonal values, that creates a contrast, all that stuff. Artists will know what I'm talking about. this render. I just mute this. So, you know, by putting everything in grayscale, it makes it much easier for us to figure out where the focus of the camera is. There's a rule of thirds, as well as a quadrant guide to help us figure out the layout of the game, as well as like a general blocking kind of guide. Now, the blocking is used for us to isolate the characters inside the scene. Really important thing, most anime/manga have character-based blocking, and that's when you know, you push the animated features. So characters can also be props, they can be animals, they can be whatever that moves inside your game, right? We highlight these to ensure that it's easier for us to bring them to the focus. So, you know, like toggling this on and off, you can kind of really start simplifying the composition inside your game. But basically just creating like tools like this will really help your game, you know, when you're going through the QA process or when you're going through that editing process, figure out what are the features you want to focus on. Now, obviously, this varies from game to game. Not all games have the same affordances that Necrobarista has. We have a very cinematic game, right? We have a game where we can essentially, you know, change every single and control every single camera angle. Some games are locked to a third-person camera. Some games are locked to, you know, top-down. But that's still fine, right? The important thing is figuring out how you actually replicate the blocking inside your games to have that in an anime-esque composition. So that's kind of most of the stuff that we did for shapes. It mainly comes down to composition. Okay, moving on. Cool. So the next thing I want to talk about, the second simple element, is shading. And it's simple for one reason. These guys solved it, right? Has anyone seen this talk? Like, just hands up if you... Okay, good. Yes, one of my slides is from another talk. Guilty Gear, a beautiful game. Very good usage of that cel shading anime art style. The newest game, the Dragon Ball Z one, is even better, so take a look at that if you can. But this talk is on YouTube. I highly recommend you guys to go check it out if you are interested in more about kind of anime style rendering. To reiterate, there are only 3 important components for cel shading. And that's, first of all, the shadow threshold, where the light and the shadow falls off. And this is controlled by a shadow bias map, which is based off usually a AO map that, you know, you can bake through your 3D model. And then manually edited by an artist. Second thing is the light vectors. Now, all the characters use their own individual custom light, which is independent from the scene lighting. Now, this is really important for being able to control kind of the angle of each character's lighting. Now, the final thing is normal vector, which is, as you can see in this image, this is kind of what, oh wait, the mouse doesn't show up. But you see the top images, that's before they edit the normals of the meshes. And afterwards is kind of what happens once you edit those normals, right? To give that non-Euclidean geometry that, that look. So how do we actually improve from there? The first thing we did is we increased the contrast between our characters and the backgrounds. Now, this is an image from Sayonara Zetsubo Sensei by Shaft. It's probably not the best example of contrast between characters and background because they have a very flat art style. But you know, if you guys look at recent hit game Cuphead, you'll notice the technique that they utilize, which is very much the old school cell, you know, drawn animation, where you have like a almost watercolor hand painted background, very static, and then these moving characters on top of everything. That's something that is, you know, pivotal towards anime art styles, and making sure that your characters pop from the background is really important. For that, we use separate rendering pipelines, so forward rendering versus deferred kind of rendering. For the characters and the background, we have a separate kind of shader pipeline set up for the characters. Now, this creates really subliminal subtle inconsistencies, which are good. So imperfect shading, imperfect depth of field kind of focal points. It also helps with optimization. And one other thing that we experimented with, and in the end kind of thrown out, was screen space textures. So you can see in this image the man's scarf, right? It uses a screen space texture, and this is something a lot of animation utilizes. So I'm going to quickly switch over to this. Now this is like a demo that we made to test out a lot of these kind of shader things. You can see up in the corner this Maddie sitting on the tram, and we did apply a screen space shader on top of her. I'm not sure you guys can see that. But it's really nice for replicating that kind of hand-drawn, sketchy look. Another game that utilizes to great effect was Hotel Dusk 215, I believe. It was a really old DS game. We threw that out for a reason I'll explain later, but that is something you can definitely utilize in your game. Cool. Sorry. Moving on. So now we start moving on to the harder stuff, lines. I think lines are the most misunderstood element in toon-style renderings. When people usually think about lines, they usually think about contours and edges, and they will be right. That's what lines are supposed to be. And that's also what machines do, right? We have edge detection, inverse hole method, ways to generate lines from contours of shapes, meshes, essentially. But that's kind of putting the cart before the horse, because while machines use shapes to define lines, again, they create the mesh first, or we create the mesh for them, and they create the line space of this mesh. Humans use lines to create shapes instead. And that's the reason why a lot of anime-style games, when they use line art, we can just tell it's not very satisfactory, right? It feels very lazy, it feels very kind of put on. So Eijima Shigenori, the character artist for Persona 5, this is just some drawings of his. And something we can see straight away is his usage of, it's almost like gesture drawing, like very simple, minimalist illustrations that, like, it's not much, but it's really good at just giving the idea of shapes, right? Now, this is something that machines don't do because it's the other way around for them. Something else you can see is the usage of weight variance that he has. Now, the Guilty Gear guys did figure out a pretty clever way to get around this, and that's through the usage of UVs. What they did is they put all of the line arts and all the contours on square UVs, which allowed them to scale the width and the weight of these lines without distortion. We threw that out the window like basically day one because we knew it was way too expensive. To give you guys an idea of the budget of their game, it takes roughly 3 months for them to make one character. And that's just something most indie studios can't afford to do. Anyway, moving on. Another artist that we really like is Himukai Yuji. His line art is really good at one thing, and that's for the definition of, for defining the shading in his artworks. That's something that a lot of artists, I'm sure you guys already know, but line art is shading. There are two things, but line art is definitely part of values, right? Line art heavily affects values. And so it's not just used for distinguishing materials in depth. We have to consider how they affect the actual values of our game. Now, quickly kind of jumping back to our Unity build. You can see the way we've used line art in Maddie over here, right? we did actually end up creating that kind of line art into shading effect. So there's actually 3 stages of shading for her mesh. We have the flat color, we have the shaded color, and then we have like a really hard shade color, which is whatever color that the line art ends up being. In the end, we threw out line art, and again, I'll explain at the very end in the GESTALT section all the things we kept and all the things we threw away. But the general gist of it is that there are a lot of elements. Like line art is very complex. There's a lot of things going on. You have to think about variance, you have to think about the weight, you have to think about the actual shape itself, you have to think about the color, you have to think about a lot of stuff. And due to our limited budget and time, we kind of stopped work on it from an R&D standpoint and focused our efforts elsewhere. But it is very much possible, and as you can see, one of the techniques we use here actually is also that jitter effect. What we did is we have every single frame, we make the mesh distort a bit, and this also, I'm going to kind of scale that up a bit, right? That gives it that kind of stop motion look to it. The line art also jitters, but it jitters in a different way to the actual mesh, so that's why you get like these gaps to give that kind of imperfect drawing look. Cool. So, moving on. So we're going to move on to what I feel was the hardest element in terms of recreating inside real-time 3D engines, and that's perspective. Brief history of perspective in art. We had to basically invent perspective. Before we invented perspective, it didn't exist. No, it existed, but inside art, it really didn't. These are some, on the grand scheme of things, fairly contemporary artworks, right, from both Eastern and Western art. And they're good, right? You can tell these are professional artists. They probably spent their entire lives mastering their craft. But something you can also see is that they do not employ perspective. And it wasn't necessarily like they were going for an isometric art style. It's more like back then, like they only knew how to do, isometric art styles. In fact, in the Old St. Paul's painting, the artist was explicitly trying to utilize perspective, and they just couldn't do it. Thankfully, the Renaissance happened, and through the Renaissance, we kind of discovered various techniques to do perspective art. And thank God for that, because obviously all our art nowadays have perfect perspective, right? No, not really. These are some images from anime, and you can see that perspective is still very much an issue. Top left one, screenshot from Attack on Titan. It's one of my favorite shows. No, it's not. But perspective is hard. Like, that's the point I'm trying to get. We are very bad at drawing perspective. Our brains are not good at mathematically processing like the perfect ratios and numbers. Conversely, machines are very good at drawing perspective. In fact, they're so good they can't do anything else but perfect perspective, usually. The third point, this is building up to something, is that we are also very sensitive to facial features. It's genetically hard-coded into our brains. And what this means is that we are very good at recognizing whether or not faces are hand-drawn through perspective distortion, right? By looking at something and by looking at the way it rotates and the way it moves, we can tell almost like straight away, that's hand-drawn or that's like CG, right? Hands and hair are also very good tells because, first of all, hands are to draw, as all the artists know, like, you just You know, usually you draw people like this because it's easier. And hair as well, mainly due to the very complicated shapes that hair form. There have been several attempts at solving this. One thing that M2 Code did is they made the emote system, which is used in quite a few visual novels these days. So it's like a pseudo 3D framework that utilizes hand-drawn sprite assets, and they piece it together in, I believe this is Unity, and you know that kind of creates a pretty good compromise, right? It's like, yeah, it moves, but it's also 2D. There are obviously several limitations to this. For one, it's not true 3D, so actual rotation is impossible, right? It's there for animation, kind of the same way like we could do animation back in Flash, but you can't actually have, you know, complete 3D rotation. I do feel like imperfect, like line art is hard, but if you had the budget and the R&D for it, you can solve that. That's fairly solvable. I feel like imperfect facial rendering is a bottleneck currently on 3D anime visuals. The combination of requiring non-Euclidean geometry, hand-drawn assets, independent facial features, and having independent controls for all of this, it creates this kind of nightmare. So what did we do in Necrobarista to actually try and solve this? Well, firstly, we actually did do this. We did draw everything in 2D, and I'll show you guys how that worked. Okay, so this is like a part of our game, and Ashley and Kishan are chatting. This is the way we did their faces. Yeah, can you guys see that? We literally just hand drew everything. It's very expensive. It's a lot of assets. It's quite time consuming. But that back then was how we thought, you know, that was the best way to replicate. Well, we weren't so much replicating as actually doing, you know, 2D art style. One of the nice things about this is that we can break down all the facial elements into the individual, you know, sprites, which let us, you know, place them on different planes, so that when we have that very, very subtle camera movement, it gives it a very slight parallax effect. Right? Halfway through development, we started looking into ways in doing this in 3D, because this is just far too expensive. And I'm glad to say we found a way. We found a way to do this. Now, this is the current build of Necrobarista, and you can see that our faces are actually 3D, like 3D. At the same time, there were a lot of tricks involved to trying to get this to look the way it does. First of all, the textures are hand-drawn, and that's very important. That's a really important step one. Second of all, especially for the eyes and the mouth, we did bring back that kind of non-Euclidean geometry for it. So one kind of really anime thing is the way that mouths work. So I'm gonna quickly just. So that's Kichan. He's very happy. He's like smiling. Hey. But if I rotate this, you guys can. Sorry, everybody should be able to see that the mouth is doing something kind of weird, right? Like, it's actually inside the face. Like, and same thing with the eyes. The eyes and the mouths are inside the face, right? They're rendered as 3D objects, but behind the actual face. The mouth does another really weird thing, which is So how the mouth actually works is usually in games, we have it as part of the face mesh. It's one big blob. One of the difficulties is we wanted to have that individual control over each of the facial assets. So right now, this still is actually an independent thing, right? It's 3D, but we have complete control. So if we wanted, him to look really goofy here, right, we could just like do this, right? Like that's completely possible. We can rotate this, right? This is, okay, man, that's weird. But no, this is all still in 3D, right? This is not just a 2D asset. And of course, it's still also tied onto our blend shapes. So it's angry. It's really angry. It's surprised now. Yeah. And how we achieve this is by creating a culling mask that acts as a portal. It's a mesh that's in front of the actual mouth object. So the mouth object is kind of like an interior cavity, right? We have teeth, we have tongue, and all that stuff. And usually without this culling mask, like you'll just see the whole thing, the whole blob, and it'll look really awkward. So what we had to do is we had to create that thing here, and then place that in front of the mouth, and only render anything that's behind, that the camera intersects with this kind of culling mask. But yeah, that's how we did kind of facial assets. And a similar thing with the eyes. Yeah, that's really disturbing. I'm going to stop that. Okay. So finally, we move on to the whole, GESTALT. That's a fancy way of saying the holistic. I'm going to show you guys something really quick. So what's significant about this animation is that despite the art style and the narrative, it's actually done by Ufotable. Ufotable, they're a studio that's quite famous for Fate Zero, the newer Fate Stay Night series as well. And their main thing is that they're very, very good at utilizing 3D CG. That obviously all looked like it was hand-drawn, and I'm sure most of it is hand-drawn. But a lot of that is actually also done through the use of 3D CG. When we worked on getting the art style down for Necrobarista, we paid a lot of attention to things like this, things like the Violent Evergarden clip, and like we wanted to do it all. We made like this thing, right? Actually, I gotta. We made like a big list of like the various elements that we thought were pivotal to creating that anime art style, and these elements that we kind of want to just shove into our game. And halfway through we realized that this isn't really working out, partially due to the budget constraint, but more importantly due to the fact that at the end of the day, we didn't just, you can't just make an anime and just put a blanket on anime and be like, yeah, all the anime things. It was time that we actually thought about the art style of the game and really tried to find a coherent, a consolidated style. Sorry. Because anime is not a monolith, a lot of people like to think of it as, but it really isn't. And especially as indie artists and indie studios, it's really important, not just from a production standpoint, but also from a marketing standpoint, from a design standpoint, to really try and find a more unique way of, visualizing our game. So we went back to the drawing board, and I started going through a lot of my influences. This is a screenshot from Nisei Monogatari by, well, the director is Akiyuki Shimbo. The character artist is somebody else, and of course the original character artist, Vofan, is somebody else as well. But the point is that Akiyuki Shimbo is not an artist. He's actually a director. And the style that he directs isn't even really anime. Other works he directed would be Sayonara Zetsubou Sensei, which I showed you guys earlier, the Madoka Magica series, right? And at the same time, like, it's very interesting to look at, like, his work, because they have such a unique presentation. And so that's the thing I'm trying to get at, is at the end, it's more important to get something that looks unique and good. Good's not very helpful. I know it's like, what is good? But you're an artist. You would know what is good. Like, you'll be happy with it. Than it is to try and just replicate, like, all these individual elements. In fact, like, this is like that list, earlier. And here you can see kind of the elements that we actually did end up keeping and the elements that we did end up throwing out. As I said before, lines, we just almost completed just throwing out everything, because there was just too much we couldn't do. It just ended up being too expensive and asset production-wise, cost prohibitive. But yeah, that's the rest we did end up doing. So I'm gonna go back to our game build one last time and show you guys a few of these things. Cool. So, one thing, sorry, this one. Oh, special shout out to Maya Kerr, by the way. Maya, if you can just wave your hand. Maya is our graphics programmer, and so she's the one who did all the hard work. I just kind of shouted things at her. I'm like, no, it's not anime enough. And she's like, what do you mean? And so yeah, this shader she basically did all by herself. You can see this has a lot of those features that we actually end up throwing away. They're still inside the game, but we just decided that it's not good for the art. It's not good for the actual overall experience of the game. One thing that I kind of want to revisit sometime is this screen gradient effect. Okay, sorry, it's a bit hard to visualize here. Now, it's really hard, obviously, trying to figure out ways to fake 2D art inside a 3D engine, because you're kind of constantly trying to trick the audience. But I think it has been pivotal to, honestly, part of our marketing. so many games these days, they utilize a photorealistic look, and they utilize a very and it's not a bad thing. There are lots of great games that use photorealism, but the point I'm trying to get at is to survive out there as indies, it's really hard, and half the reason why people actually give out a game a second glance is due to the visuals, right? Like that's most of your marketing. Like you put out a good trailer, and people look at it and they think it looks nice. They don't even need to play the game. They don't even need to know anything about the game, and they'll add to Steam wish list. The press will be interested. So I do think it is very much worthwhile for indies to spend a good amount of the budget on figuring out ways to render their game in perhaps a non-photorealistic art style, but just finding that niche, finding that uniqueness to kind of market your game as. But yeah. And yeah, that's the end of my talk. I'm Kevin Chen. Thank you for listening. And so the last plot twist is, if you guys recognize from the earlier photo, that Joe guy, he's still working with me. So it's come a long way. Yep. Any questions? Oh, yes.
The scratchy line shader thing that you threw out,
Yep.
which I think is absolutely awesome, so well done on that. Is it done procedurally, or do you have to supply it with some scratchy lines?
We use a texture.
Yeah.
Yep.
The 3D mouth that you showed that rendered inside the face, I was wondering what techniques you used to stop it rendering at certain angles, like too far behind the head, and to stop rendering the parts on the inside.
Please, Mayor to the stage. Yeah.
Hi, I'll just come on here so that the video recording actually has my response. So it was the how do you not get it like showing through stuff?
From like behind and also like the top of the inside of the mouth, like get just a couple of back places.
Yeah. So there's two parts of that, which is first of all, I remember Kevin was talking about that kind of like portal mesh. So we rendered that with backface culling on. It's just regular polygon, so switch on backface culling and you don't see it from behind. There is a little bit more than that going on as well, which is for things like, I don't know if you quite got the angle for it, but for example, stuff like character has a nose, and like you want the mouth to render in front of the mouth bit, but then if you have an angle like that, you want the nose to poke down over the mouth, even though it's part of the same mesh, it's just further out anyway. So the way we do that is like you said, the mouth mesh is like inside the face, and so the portal thing, it's not really actually like outside the face, it's like on there, but the shader that it does basically, I don't know, like graphics tech terms, sorry, anyway, it's like after you've projected it into Quillip space in the vertex shader, so like once it's already in the screen, we then like use an offset along the Z, so that even though, for the purpose of like perspective calculation where it ends up on screen, it's inside the face, but then for purposes of like the depth buffer and culling and so on, it's actually like here or whatever. Well, it's artist controllable, so we find a value that's like, that offset is enough that it'll draw in front of the face, but then anything a bit further out, it'll still be behind that and not colored. So that's how it works.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a custom one. Or
So we obviously made a custom shader for all of our character bits, but it used the same base shader as any other material. So the skin, it doesn't have any special property to it. Cool. Yeah. So, yep. Thank you.